Hi again, Peter. Thanks for
Hi.
meeting me this evening. This year is the 50th anniversary of the founding of Gay Liberation Front in Britain. It's also 30th anniversary of the founding of Outrage. So we wanted to meet up with you and hear about your experiences. Both organizations, of course, are quite well-known and popular among the LGBT activists here, especially Outrage. You know, you've been campaigning since 1967. I read it today on Peter Tatchell Foundation's website. So you must have been about 15, 16 when you started.
Yeah, I began my campaigning when I was still at school, age 15, way back in 1967. And I had no role models or mentors. All I could do was read my history. So I read about the struggles of other people in the past, the Chartists who fought for working class votes in Parliament in the 19th century, the suffragettes who fought for votes for women, and of course people like Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and others.
Mm-hmm. You said, you know, I was wondering because you've been, you know, like we are talking about 50th anniversary of GLF, but you've been campaigning much longer than that. And I said to myself, how does he do this? You know, so many years, how has he done it? Is there anything in your background, in your upbringing that prepared you for that?
Nothing whatsoever. I was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1952. My family were working class. My father was a factory worker. My mother was mostly a housewife, but sometimes worked in the local biscuit factory. They were fairly right-wing evangelical Christians. They weren't interested in social issues or community action. Their life just focused around the family and the church. So there was nothing in my background that really prepared me at all. And to this day, I don't know and understand how I turned out to be the lifelong radical that I am.
Yeah, you've taken a completely different route compared to your family.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Now, shall we start with talking about GLF? And with your permission, I'd like to share your video, credit to Peter Tatchell Foundation. Is that okay?
Of the Gay Liberation Front was the watershed moment in British LGBT plus history. For the first time ever, thousands of us came out and protested in the streets against our persecutors, especially the church and police. GLF's battle cries were "Gay is good" and "Gay pride." This challenged the prejudice of centuries that said gay was shameful and was bad, mad, and sad. We stood in solidarity with other oppressed people, supporting women's, black, and working class liberation. GLF's goal was not assimilation into the flawed straight status quo. We strove for the transformation of society, to create a new sexual democracy with justice and freedom for all. We went from victims to victors. And 50 years on, we are still fighting for LGBT plus liberation in the UK and worldwide.
GLF was founded in 13th of October 1970, almost like 50 years and 1 month. And as far as I know, 19 people met in a basement at London School of Economics. And I would like to know what was the atmosphere in Britain at that time in terms of, LGBT community, and what triggered those 19 people to get together.
The momentum for LGBT plus activism had been building for some years. There had earlier been a successful campaign to partly decriminalise male homosexuality in England and Wales, which happened in 1967.
Okay.
Off the back of that success, many other LGBT plus people wanted to fight all the other issues where we were marginalised, excluded, and discriminated against. So the trigger for that meeting was two young students, Bob Mellors and Aubrey Walter, had been in the United States in the summer of 1970 and witnessed the emergence of the new Gay Liberation Front there. They'd also attended the People's Revolutionary Convention in Philadelphia, which was organized by the Black Panthers, which sought to bring together a broad coalition of social movements to strive for radical social change. So they came back to Britain fired up, and they called this meeting, and 19 people turned up. I wasn't one of them. I wasn't even in the country at the time. But the atmosphere in Britain in that era was very hostile. Although there had been a partial decriminalisation of male homosexuality in 1967, police repression continued and in fact got worse. Most aspects of gay male life remained criminalised. It was only decriminalised between two men aged 21 or over in the privacy of their own home with no other person present in any part of the house, behind locked doors, windows, and with the curtains drawn. Anything else was still totally illegal. As well as there being a big increase in the arrests of gay and bisexual men after 1967, in that era, there were no openly LGBT plus public figures, no pop stars, politicians, entertainers, writers, nobody. At that time, the only instance where you would see the reporting of LGBT plus people is if we are arrested for murder, child molestation, or spying. There was no good news about LGBT plus people. The medical and psychiatric professions in Britain still regarded homosexuality as an illness, and there was still the practice of electroshock conversion therapy to try and make gay people straight. And that was actually paid for and funded by the National Health Service. In addition, we had no protection against discrimination. So employers could refuse to hire you or sack you from your job. Landlords could refuse to let you property or evict you from rented accommodation. You can be turned away from pubs and restaurants. We had no legal rights, and Parliament would not even discuss LGBT plus issues. It wouldn't even discuss them. That's how bad things were. And
how did you get involved? I know you are one of the co-founders of GLF. And how did you get involved? What prompted you?
No, I wasn't a co-founder of GLF.
You aren't?
I arrived in London some months later from Australia.
Oh, okay.
And then I joined. But GLF had already been in operation for several months before I arrived.
Were you there during the festival light? Because
yes,
one of the yes. Would you tell us a little bit the disruption of opening of Festival Light? The viewers in Turkey, they wouldn't know what that is about. Firstly, can you explain us what that was about and why GLF decided to take an action against it?
The Festival of Light was a Christian-inspired morality campaign targeting opposition to homosexuality, pornography, and abortion. And the leaders of that movement were very stridently anti-LGBT plus, against women having the right to choose, and against any kind of imagery which celebrated sexuality. So Outrage, of which I was a part at that time, we organized Operation Rupert, which was named after the cheeky Rupert Bear cartoon in the satirical magazine, or the leftish anarchist sort of magazine Oz. And our plan was to disrupt the grand opening festival of the Festival of Light in Westminster Central Hall in the heart of London. So we turned up and at various stages throughout the proceedings interrupted. So I was in the youth group, and at a certain point we stood up and started same-sex kissing. At another point, gay men in nun drag, wearing habits of nuns, got up and kissed. Mice were released into the audience. It was chaos. It was pandemonium. But the point was to disrupt and challenge their festival, to indicate that we were not supportive of their kind of homophobic, misogynistic, and Puritan agenda.
Okay. Coming back today, in June, you attended the Pride March in London, also to celebrate 50th anniversary of GLF. I read today that you are one of those who organized the first UK Pride March. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
That was in London in 1972.
1972. And you attended each one since then?
Every single one, yeah.
Every single one of them. So, and in June, it was your 49th.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
We're here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Gay Liberation Front, which ignited the modern movement for LGBT plus rights in Britain. And we're also here to reclaim pride. Yes. Pride can be a celebration, but it also must be a march for LGBT plus human rights here in Britain and around the world. And today, we especially want to send our solidarity to Black Lives Matter and Black LGBT plus people of colour all over the world.
I think there were 12 of the last surviving activists from the original GLF. Is that correct?
Well, they're the last 12 that we know of, but there were and are others who were either too sick to attend or too elderly, or didn't want to attend because of the risk of the coronavirus. And there are others, but we don't have contact with them.
Okay.
But these are 12 who definitely were involved originally, yeah.
And one of the demands that were made was around putting the politics back into Pride. And you've been to you went to all these Pride marches, and I remember, I think it must be 1992 or 3. It was in Kennington Park, then Brixton Brockwell Park. I can't remember the years. There was completely different atmosphere there. Then Pride marches in London, it changed. It got bigger, and And I mean, it seems to have lost its touch. And I'd like to ask you, what do you mean by when you say putting politics back into pride? And especially you observed all the changes over the years. What happened?
Well, first let me say that the first Pride, which was organised in London in July 1972, was very much a joyful celebration, but it also had very clear, defined political demands, such as an equal age of consent, such as the abolition of other anti-gay laws that still remain. Now today, Pride parades have become incredibly commercialized and corporate. The floats of big corporate sponsors tend to dominate the parade because the corporate sponsors are the ones with the money, so they can make the most fabulous floats. And that means that grassroots community groups are overshadowed. It's also been very noticeable that Pride parades have switched to sort of vague sort of slogans or themes like love is everywhere or so on, which is nice in its own way, but there are still human rights battles to fight. And so the politics has been somewhat, airbrushed out. On last year's parade, that's 2019, before coronavirus, when there was last a major parade. There were only about 10 or at the most 20 groups that had any political demands. All the rest were just celebrating themselves, which is great. But there was no real feel from the Pride parade that we were still fighting for our rights, and there was not much sense of solidarity with LGBT+ people in other countries. So that's what I mean when I think that when I say that Pride has lost its way, that it's not as strongly political as it once was.
And you made some 5 demands, I think, in June. One was about UK ending detention and deportation of LGBT asylum seekers. I read an article the other day, 98%, I think in 2010, 98% of LGBT asylum seekers' applications are rejected in the UK. It might have changed now, but that was in 2010. And the second one...
It's less now, but it's still much higher than the rate of refusal is still much higher for LGBT+ refugees compared to political, ethnic, or religious refugees. Mm-hmm. So the rate of refusal is still very, very high.
Still very high. And your second demand was let people define their own gender, not doctors or the state.
Yeah, and this is like supporting the trans and non-binary struggle to get away from this dichotomy of male, female, masculine, feminine, to allow people to be what they want to be and to not require doctors, the state, or the church to have any say in how we define ourselves.
And the third one, mandatory LGBT+ education in every school.
Yes, now that has actually in principle been agreed and is due to come into force. The problem is the government has not spelled out what precisely the content of that education will be. So it may be very good or it may be very poor, we just don't know. Mm-hmm. And also, of course, the government does allow faith schools, religious schools, a get out. They are still allowed to teach their own views on sexuality, which in most cases says that LGBT relationships are, immoral, sinful, abnormal, unnatural. So giving religious schools, which now comprise a third of all schools in Britain, giving them this exemption is a big failing in terms of the legislation.
Oh, I didn't know that. A third of schools are faith schools in Britain. And the fourth one, religion, hands-off humans and LGBT plus bodies. And
yeah, we're simply saying that people are entitled to their own religious beliefs, but they're not entitled to dictate to everyone else how we should behave according to what they think is the right way to behave.
And the last one being is solidarity with Black Lives Matter and LGBT plus people of color worldwide.
Yeah. Yeah, we think it's very important in the tradition of the Gay Liberation Front to stand in solidarity with all oppressed people. You know, we have our own battle to fight, but we must also recognize that others have battles to fight as well. So, you know, Black and people of color, disabled people, women, and so on.
Okay. 1980s. I know at one point you became a member of Labour Party, and you stood for the Parliament. I'm curious. I'd like to know that transition. How was it for you from human rights activism to mainstream politics, if that's the correct term? How was that for you?
Well, for me, the objective of activism is to get things done. So when an opportunity arose for me to stand for selection as a Labour candidate in my local constituency, I decided to do that on the basis that I wasn't giving up the fight, but I was trying to take the fight inside Parliament to shape things up and to get things done through the parliamentary process, as well as continuing to do and support extra parliamentary direct action and civil disobedience. As you know, I was defeated in that election in 1983. Most commentators say it was the dirtiest, most violent, and definitely most homophobic election in Britain in the 20th century.
Yeah, so I know this. So I heard about. I remember reading about this.
But I wasn't deterred. You know, I lost, but I just thought, well, okay, I'll just carry on campaigning, and maybe that was the best thing to do, because, you know, if I'd been elected, I would have been compromised with a lot of parliamentary duties and constituency work. Whereas being outside Parliament, I've had more time and energy and opportunity to do extra parliamentary direct action.
Exactly. You are a member of Green Party at the moment, aren't you? I think you've been a member since 2004.
Yes. So I left Labour in 1999, disillusioned over its rightward drift. And for a few years, I was just independent. But then I decided to join the Green Party. I often worked with the Greens in the past. And in terms of LGBT plus rights and social justice issues, the Greens are the most left of the parties, the main major parties in Britain. So I'm very comfortable with the Greens.
That's great. When I was in England, I used to be a member as well. But I mean, talking about 80s, I arrived in London, I think, summer of 1990. I want to talk a little bit about HIV. And for me personally, coming from Istanbul, I had read about it in papers, etc. But then suddenly the scale of loss was shocking for me. And I even remember the first time, I think I met someone in a pub and he told me that he was coming from a funeral. And then I kept on hearing this. Can you tell us a little bit about late 80s, early 90s HIV and AIDS, and how the community responded to the crisis?
Well, the 1980s were like living through a civil war. You know, young gay men were dying on a massive scale, which is normally only experienced during wartime. And initially, the government was indifferent. It gave no support, took no action. It was only when the first heterosexual people began dying that the government was moved to suddenly start taking action in terms of belatedly protecting the blood supply, having ignored requests to do so for many years, and then beginning to fund the organizations like the Terence Higgins Trust, which had been created by the LGBT plus community to provide information, education, and safer sex advice.
What kind of impact do you think HIV activism had on general LGBT activism?
Well, a lot of people who had been involved in LGBT plus activism went into HIV activism. So relatively speaking, the LGBT plus movement was weakened because so many people stopped working in that area to focus on HIV and AIDS. But of course, the health emergency of HIV did give these mostly gay HIV activists access to government, to medical institutions, hospitals, on an unprecedented scale. So it forced the government to row back on some of their homophobia in order to deal with this health crisis. It was only really by the end of the 80s that people really began getting back into LGBT plus activism. The trigger of that was, of course, Section 28, which was legislated in 1988. It was the first new anti-gay law in Britain in 100 years. And it prohibited local authorities, such as local councils and municipalities, local health authorities, local education authorities, from doing anything that could be construed as, quote, promoting homosexuality. And this meant that local authorities refused to allow LGBT groups to meet on council premises. They scrapped funding. It meant that schools took books by gay authors out of their libraries. Teachers would not provide any supportive counseling to LGBT plus pupils. It was a very, very dark period. But that's what really reignited the LGBT plus movement.
But Section 28 did, however, galvanise an entire generation of gay activists, like Boone Temple and Sally Francis. Sally abseiled into the House of Lords as they debated the law, and Boone was one of the women who stormed the BBC 6 o'clock news live on air.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. In the House of Lords, a vote is taking place now on a challenge to the poll tax. Tory rebels have said...
We at least had to mark the moment, had to get people to know that this terrible, terrible thing was happening.
Protesting about rights for lesbian and gay people.
What would you say to people who would say, well, it was kind of pointless because it was happening, we lost?
We're talking about it now, today, 30 years of the anniversary, and we're hearing about people like yourself who it countered their feeling of isolation.
It was state-promoted homophobia. That's a terrible, terrible thing. It's not a nothing. It's not like it doesn't matter and it didn't matter. It still matters.
And in 1987, there were about 15,000 people on the Pride Parade. In 1988, it doubled to almost 29,000. So that was a huge sudden increase. And it also brought together the lesbian, bisexual, gay and transgender movement back into one single movement, whereas before they'd somewhat split off. So it was in many ways the making of the modern LGBT plus movement in Britain. Mm-hmm. A response to HIV and AIDS ultimately benefited straight people as well, because we devised and popularized safer sex, which is then taken over by the government, mm-hmm. and that helped save straight lives as well as LGBT plus ones.
Exactly.
We were out. We were full of rage. It's been 30 years of fierce, defiant queers. Outrage was formed in May 1990. It was a remarkable social movement that mobilized the grassroots LGBT plus community on a scale never seen before. It raised public awareness about the enormity of anti-LGBT plus discrimination. It challenged and shamed homophobes everywhere, and it put the government and public institutions under pressure to change. Outrage did an average of 2 non-violent direct action or civil disobedience protests every month. People were willing to get arrested if need be, and many were. We were not afraid to take on our oppressors, including the Church and the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Carey.
Supports discrimination against lesbian and gay people. He opposes lesbian and gay human rights. This is not
Highlights include the kissing, outing the bishops, the disruption of police entrapment operations, and our condom protest at Westminster's Catholic Cathedral, the attempted arrest of President Robert Mugabe, and the Stop Murder Music campaign. Outrage Direct Action put LGBT plus rights in the headlines, raised public awareness, provoked debate, changed hearts and minds, and forced the establishment to curb its homophobia and change the law. We helped transform the lives of LGBTs. We went from victims to victors.
So it's the 30th anniversary of Outrage. And I think an event triggered you come together and set up Outrage. Would you like to share it with us?
Well, Outrage was set up in May 1990. It was set up in, I suppose, reaction to 2 things: a massive spike in police arrests of gay and bisexual men for consenting same-sex behavior, and also a huge spike in violent assaults and even murders of LGBT plus people. The final straw was the murder of Michael Booth in West London, who was kicked to death by a gang of youths. We just felt, that's it. We're not going to put up with this anymore. The existing organizations are not doing enough. They're not active enough. They're not pushing for our rights. We have to do something. So Outrage was set up, very much modeled on, to some extent, the Gay Liberation Front in the 1970s, and also the suffragettes and the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States. We were a group that was explicitly committed to non-violent direct action and civil disobedience. And our first campaigns were about police harassment and the murders of LGBT plus people. It prompted massive media coverage and public debate. It resulted in the police beginning their first serious negotiations with the LGBT plus community, and eventually led to major reforms. Firstly, within a year of Outrage making its demands for a non-homophobic policing policy, 3/4 of our demands were met by the police. And as a result, the number of gay and bisexual men convicted for consenting behavior fell by 2/3 within 3 years. Mm-hmm. That is the biggest, fastest fall ever recorded. On top of that, the police began to much more seriously investigate the murders of gay people. They put out public appeals to the general public, but they'd also put out specific public appeals to the LGBT+ community. So we got results pretty quickly, and literally that made a huge difference to a lot of people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to check something with you. I read about this GLF, but also Outrage. I think there was this entry in 1992 from an attempt to entry from far left organizations to Outrage. And I think the same thing happened to GLF as well. What is it about far left organizations and LGBT?
Well, of course, back in the days of the Gay Liberation Front, in the early days of the Gay Liberation Front, with one or two minor exceptions, most left-wing groups did not support LGBT+ rights. Some adopted the Stalinist view that homosexuality was a bourgeois perversion, that it would die out under a perfect socialist society. This was a very common view among orthodox communist parties and even some of the Trotskyist splinter groups as well. In 1973, I went to what was then communist East Germany, to the World Festival of Youth and Students, and staged a series of gay rights protests, which ended up resulting in me being arrested and interrogated by the secret police, the Stasi. Mm-hmm. But off the back of that, it got huge coverage here in Britain, and that's what prompted left-wing groups to begin to change to support LGBT+ rights, because they were very embarrassed, not only that I had been arrested and interrogated in a communist country, which made their ideas that communism was better look ridiculous, but also, of course, some of the people in the British delegation who were communists and other left-wingers, they physically assaulted me and tried to and did beat me up because they regarded me as a gay person as bringing shame to the left-wing movement, that gay was sick and immoral and shameful. But anyway, the reaction against that resulted in most left-wing groups in Britain fairly soon embracing LGBT rights, largely, or perhaps partly, because of opportunism. They were just embarrassed at having been called out and caught out, behaving so appallingly, and didn't want to be seen as, reactionary. But I think in time, they did genuinely come over to support LGBT+ rights. That's a bit of a detour on my story. There were not so much attempts to infiltrate Gay Liberation Front, because, as I said, in those days, a lot of left-wing groups were anti-gay. Mm-hmm. But certainly with Outrage, there were repeated attempts by left-wing groups to infiltrate and take over Outrage. I suppose partly because they saw us as being a very successful group, that as left-wing groups, they weren't making much progress. They weren't having success, but we were having success. We had an incredibly high public profile. We're on the news all the time. We were, discussed on radio and TV programs. They were jealous. They wanted some of the action. So we had to fight very strongly to repel them, because we knew they weren't doing this because they genuinely supported us or because they were LGBT themselves. They were just trying to take us over so they could get kudos for their own organization.
Okay. In 1994, I think you disrupted Church of England, Archbishop of Durham Michael Turnbull's ordination. And then, as we saw in the video as well, Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Carey's sermon, I think Sunday sermon. Firstly, Michael Turnbull, why was he targeted, or what was the protest about?
He was due to be enthroned as the Bishop of Durham, and had a long history of anti-gay remarks, despite the fact that he himself had been gay in his youth, and I think had actually been arrested and convicted of a gay offence. He shouldn't have been, you know, it was a consenting offence. But, you know, we just felt it was incredibly hypocritical for him to denounce gay people while having had a gay past. So we went to Durham Cathedral and protested outside as he made his procession to the cathedral to be enthroned. So it was all about homophobia and hypocrisy. And it was the same when we named the 10 Anglican bishops.
Yeah, that's
him and 10 others in 1994 on the steps of the Church of England annual conference. We named them not because they were gay and in the closet, but because they were hypocritical and homophobic. They were preaching against homosexuality. They were supporting the church's hostility to LGBT plus rights, while at the same time being gay. And we saw that as just being two-faced. So that's why we called them out.
And what was the press's reaction to that? Were their names published, or?
The press reaction was very, very hostile against us. We were the victims of homophobia, defending our community, but we were seen as the bad guys because we had named these bishops. And the press said, oh, you must respect their right to privacy. To which we said, well, the bishops don't respect our right to privacy. They want to invade our privacy. They think the law should invade our bedrooms. They think we should be subjected to discrimination in law. If they won't respect us, we won't respect them. And we thought that was a very fair thing to say.
And how was the LGBT community's response? Because I remember at the time discussing this with my friends, and we were like split, you know, including myself. We were supporting Outrage, and the other group was saying, oh, this is outrageous, you can't interfere. But that's my experience in a small circle of friends. How did the community react?
Well, you're right. The LGBT plus community was split. Some supported Outrage and others didn't. You know, others, you know, traditionally, I suppose many people had feared being outed in an era when it was illegal to be gay, when you could be sacked from your job or evicted from your home. So many felt that outing was a no-no. But we said, we're not outing anybody because they're in the closet. We're not doing this for homophobic reasons. We're doing it to defend our community. What we're doing is queer self-defense. You know, when we are under attack, we have a right to defend ourselves. And if people in the church are aligned with church policy that condemns us, that persecutes us, which actually says that the law should discriminate against us, then we have a right to fight back by any peaceful means necessary.
I mean, as you said, this issue split the community. Did Outrage represent the whole sections of the LGBT community? Who did Outrage represent?
Outrage represented Outrage, our activists and supporters. We never claimed to represent the whole community. That would be impossible because there's so much difference and divergence within that community. But we said we have a right to hold our particular point of view and to campaign in the way that we see fit to advance LGBT plus rights. And we were able to point to the many successes that we had achieved that mainstream lobbying had not. So we said, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Look what we have done. We have changed things. That means we were doing the right thing.
Mugabe.
President Mugabe, I'm very pleased to meet you. I'm putting you under arrest on charges of torture under the United Nations Convention against... Very pleased to meet you. I'm putting you under arrest on charges of torture under the United Nations Convention against Torture. Torture is a crime under international law. President Mugabe, you are under...
Peter, why was it important to arrest them? I think this took place in Brussels. First, can you briefly explain what a citizen arrest is? Because we don't have that in Turkey, as far as I know.
Under British law in most English-speaking countries, a private citizen has the right to arrest a person if they have good grounds to believe that they have committed a crime. So it's called the power of citizen's arrest. Mm-hmm. So President Mugabe was a liberation hero. He helped free Zimbabwe from white minority rule. It used to be very similar to apartheid South Africa. Mm-hmm. He changed that. He was a hero. But very soon after he came to power, he began to become increasingly dictatorial and later on became increasingly homophobic. So Outrage decided that we should try to do a citizen's arrest on President Mugabe because we knew that governments like the British and others were too cowardly to do so. So we chose the law against torture because it was enshrined in British and European law and international law. Mm-hmm. Under that law, any state official who authorizes, condones, acquiesces, or colludes with acts of torture can be arrested and put on trial. So the legal case was very, very strong. We had evidence of the torture of 2 black journalists who'd been tortured by Mugabe on his say-so. They weren't gay, it wasn't a gay issue, but they were victims of torture, and we had that case. So the legal basis for his arrest was rock solid. We attempted a first citizen's arrest in London in 1999 when we ambushed his motorcade and actually had President Mugabe under arrest. But when we called the police to hand him over, the police arrested us and President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods, a very big, luxurious department store. Then I made a second attempt in Brussels in 2001 in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel, which is where you saw that footage. I didn't succeed. I was very, very badly beaten by his bodyguards and eventually, in fact, knocked unconscious and ended up with some brain and eye damage as a result. Neither attempt succeeded, but both attempts got masses of media coverage all around the world. So it helped draw public attention to Mugabe's human rights abuses. And that was a great morale boost for people inside Zimbabwe who thought the outside world didn't know and didn't care. So, you know, we didn't succeed, but we had some positive outcome as a result.
I'd like to ask you, individual activism versus collective activism. You were often part of an organization.
Yeah. Well, every successful movement for social change is a collective action. You think throughout history, it's almost invariably been a group of people, often a large group of people, who've successfully pushed for social change. Occasionally, individuals can play a role, but really it's the movement that's key. And that has been the case in Britain in our struggle for LGBT+ rights. I haven't changed things. The movement has changed things. We collectively have changed things.
Thanks for that, Peter. And thank you very much again for meeting me, answering all my questions.
Can I just perhaps finish by saying a few things?
Please.
To conclude, I'd like to pay tribute to Turkish LGBT+ activists for your struggles and your heroism. You are fighting for freedom under much more difficult circumstances, with much greater state repression. And I know that many of you have been arrested and beaten by the police over the years. And I want to say that I am in awe of your courage and determination. You inspire me because despite the dangers to your life and liberty, you keep up the fight. That is truly, truly awesome. And I want to thank you on behalf of my friends and supporters. We want to thank you for the witness you have done for LGBT+ rights. We really admire and appreciate you. And finally, I'll just finish with my motto, which of course you all believe in. Don't accept the world as it is. Dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen.